I know guys, it's been far too long since I've done an update on my nano tank, but today we are going to do just that. We'll do a full overview of the tank and the equipment, then we'll take a look at any new fish and corals that I've purchased over the last few months. Let's go. I'll start with a full overview of the tank and the equipment, so if you're new to the channel you can see exactly what I've got going on. The tank itself is an innovative marine Nuvo 20. It's an all-in-one system, which means there's no sump below and the chambers in the back are where you house your equipment and your filtration. Total system volume is 20 gallons, which is around 75 litres. That does include the chambers at the back. The display dimensions, excluding the rear chambers, are 60 centimetres wide, 30 centimetres deep and 33 centimetres high. As reef tanks go, it's pretty small, but it is perfect if you're new to the hobby and you don't want to spend a ton of money setting up your first reef tank. Being an all-in-one system means you don't have a sump below, so you can pretty much place this tank on any piece of furniture that will take the weight. The light is an Ecotech XR15 Gen 4, which I bought used. It's a great light, but brand new, it is bloody expensive. I bought mine when the Gen 5 was first released, and I took advantage of everyone upgrading their Gen 4 lights to the Gen 5s, so I got myself a bargain. The light was 3 years old when I got it, and I've had it for a year, and it's not missed a beat. I recently upgraded the mount on the light, as the previous mount broke when I first installed it. I bodged it together with a nut and bolt. It worked fine, but it didn't look that great. The new mount only cost me a tenner, and I much prefer the design of the new compared to the old. There's a much bigger distance between the top of the light and the bottom of the mount arm, which allows for a bit more breathing space and better access to clean the top. I'm running the Ecotech AB Plus schedule, which is a preset schedule made by Ecotech, and I run it at 40% intensity. With the diffuser attached, it gives me around 80 power on the sandbed and around 100 to 120 power on the rock structure. It works perfectly for the corals that I keep. As for filtration, it's pretty minimal on this system. Being an all-in-one system, the rear chambers are where the magic happens and where I keep all my filtration and equipment. The water from the display overflows into the two far chambers, one on the left and one on the right, and that's where I keep my mechanical filtration in the form of filter floss. I change my filter floss once per week. I keep my filter floss in these little 3D printed cups that a mate of mine kindly made. It just makes keeping the filter floss in there nice and easy to get in, easy to get out, and it doesn't fall all the way to the bottom of chamber 1. Moving inward to chamber 2, I have 1 kilogram of max spec ceramic media. This is my biological filtration. It's a minimalistic aquascape and there isn't a lot of rocking in the main display. So the ceramic media that I've got in this chamber compensates for the lack of rock in the tank. Chamber 2 on the left is empty. I used to run a skimmer, but with the small bio load I have in this tank, it was overkill and it wasn't necessary, so I removed it a while back. As for the other equipment, I'm running a 100 watt titanium heater in the middle chamber. This is controlled by the D&D temperature controller with the temperature sensor placed below the filter floss in chamber 1. The auto top off is from TMC. It's controlled by a float switch rather than an optical sensor. I had a bad experience a few weeks ago with my D&D optical sensor on my Red Sea Reefer 250. So I switched this tank over to the float switch. It's one of the cheapest and most reliable auto top-offs I've owned. This one's about 4 years old and it's still going strong. The auto top-off reservoir is below the tank in this cabinet along with the pump controllers. The auto top-off reservoir is 10 litres and I top this barrel up weekly. For flow, I'm using the included MightyJet return pump with 2 random flow generators on the return nozzles. I'm also using the TMC Reef Tide Wave Maker. I run the Wave Maker at 100% on pulse mode, 24/7. It's only a small tank and it's mainly soft corals in here, so it doesn't need a ton of flow and this setup works great for me. Now let's move on to the display, the fish and the corals in this tank. We'll start with the fish as there isn't that much to talk about. I have 2 clownfish in this tank. I've had them since juveniles and they're around 2 years old now. Clownfish are great, but they can be quite territorial. The female clownfish is an absolute bugger for biting my hand every time it goes into this tank. Other than that, they're great fish and they're one of the easiest saltwater fish I've ever kept. I do have another fish in this tank, but honestly, you wouldn't think so. I rarely see it and it only comes out when I feed the tank. It's a purple firefish, and this is probably going to be an unpopular opinion, but it's hands down one of the most boring fish I've ever kept. It spends 99% of its time in its cave. It comes out for 5 minutes in the morning, 5 minutes in the evening, and that's only when I feed the tank. It darts straight back into its cave and spends the rest of its time there. Don't get me wrong, it is a stunning fish, but God, it is boring. Now for the corals. I'm not sure when the last update was done on this tank, so I have no idea how much has changed. I know that there's a few corals that you definitely haven't seen, but first we'll do a little overview. The tank is softly dominated, with the main choice of coral being Zoa. I've got a few different variants in the tank, so let's have a quick look around and name a few. We've got scrambled eggs, fake lime chilies, orange oxides, purple monsters, and pink zippers. All of the zoas in this tank are relatively cheap, nice and colourful. Don't tend to go for the high-end expensive zoas because I've had bad experiences in the past, but I find that you can get some really nice contrasting colour variants without spending an absolute fortune. I've got a couple of different mushrooms, mainly discosomas. I do have a couple of rhodactus, one Llama, and also one bounce. I was in two minds whether to put this bounce mushroom back in this tank, but it split in my main display and I couldn't bring myself to part with it, so I ended up putting it back in here. There's a few acans and blastos dotted around on the rocks, but my favourite piece in this tank has to be the rock flower nem. As anemones go, it's pretty tame and nothing like a bubble tip. If I had a bubble tip in this tank, it probably would have done 10 laps around the tank by now and stung every single one of my corals. I placed it in this exact position 9 months ago and it hasn't moved an inch. I also picked up this green Kenya tree from the same guy that I picked up my New York Knicks torch from. Believe it or not, this is actually the first leather coral that I've ever owned. I was under the impression that leather corals were mainly brown, a bit dull, and this one is an absolute stunner. I'm chuffed to bits with it, and I'm actually now on the hunt for more leather corals to add to this tank. So if you've got any suggestions on leather corals, drop them down in the comments below. I also popped over to my LFS last week and picked up a few more corals. I've added a couple of feather duster worms. These guys are super cheap and awesome. They are filter feeders, so they feed off anything floating in the water column. I also picked up this big zoa rock. This piece was an absolute steal. Considering how many zoas are on this rock, I got an absolute bargain. I also picked up a couple of mushrooms, this rhodactus at the front and this Llama between the blastos and the zoas. There is a big area of this tank that does need some attention. This area here is looking a bit sparse and a bit bland. I am going to cover that in a future video, and we'll cover this little area here with some nice corals. I have a few corals fragged up in my other tank which I want to place in here, but if you do have any other suggestions as to what you think I should place in here, drop it down in the comments below. As for nutrients, nitrates are sitting happily at around 5 parts per million and phosphates are around 0.06. Considering there's nothing more than filter floss and some ceramic media in the back, I'm pretty happy with that. Having a low bio load really helps with keeping nutrients in check. I don't carbon dose. In fact, I don't dose anything on this tank. I do a 10% water change every 2 weeks and everything seems happy. I don't test the parameters on this tank nearly as much as I do on my main display, but given my coral choices, I don't really need to. The corals are very forgiving, and honestly, with the amount of attention this tank gets, it's probably a good job. So that's my nano tank. It's a super simple setup and it doesn't require a ton of maintenance. It suits my needs well, as I spend the majority of my time tending to my Red Sea Reefer 250, so it's a perfect second tank for me. That'll pretty much wrap it up for this week's video. If you've enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe, and I'll catch you next week, guys.